Victoria Hale built a company worth nearly $1 billion, but on the one night she needed someone to show up for her, every person she trusted disappeared. As the candles burned lower and the silence became impossible to ignore, one ordinary black single father made a decision that would expose who truly belonged in her life. And before the night was over, nothing either of them believed about success, family, or kindness would ever be the same again. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The ballroom sat 40 floors above the city, glass walls turning the skyline into a second chandelier. Gold rimmed every chair, white orchids crowded the tables. A cake rose in 3 tiers near the window, its frosting still sharp at the edges because no knife had touched it. Every seat was set, every name card was placed, every chair was empty. Victoria sat near the head table in a green satin dress, her wheelchair angled toward the entrance. Each time the elevator chimed down the hall, her hands went still against the armrests. Each time the doors opened on no one. Her assistant kept refreshing her phone, reading out excuses like a weather report, a board member stuck in traffic, an investor's flight delayed, a friend from college with a sudden family emergency. Victoria nodded at each one like she believed it. She had built her company from a 2-desk office with a space heater that only worked if it was kicked. She paid her staff before she paid herself, and she still did, 15 years later, even though the company filled 4 floors of a building with her name on the lease. People used to call that integrity. Lately, they had called it something else, something they did not say out loud, before the accident and after. The accident took 11 seconds. A wet highway, a truck that did not stop in time, and glass across 3 lanes. It did not take her life. It took the use of her legs, and something she never expected to lose along with them, which was the room's attention the moment she could no longer stand to command it. For a while she had told herself it was the wheelchair people flinched at. She knew better then. It was not the chair, it was that she could no longer perform the version of strength they had grown used to, and the people who loved that performance went looking for someone else's. She glanced at the clock again. It was 6:58. 2 servers stood near the kitchen doors, not moving, unsure whether to keep the trays warm or start covering them. A pianist waited at the grand piano, his hands resting on his knees instead of the keys. Nobody had told him to stop playing. Nobody had told him to start. Across town, in an apartment where the window unit only cooled the one room, Dennis Dixon set down the last box from a 14-hour shift. His daughter Maya sat at the kitchen table doing homework under the stove light because it was the warmest spot in the apartment after 6. He was not rich. He had not been rich since his wife had died 4 years prior, since the hospital bills had eaten through the small cushion they had built together, dollar by dollar. But every evening Maya ran the same 3 steps to reach him at the door, and every evening he crouched down so she did not have to reach far. That night, before he headed out for his last delivery run, she handed him a card. There were butter yellow crayon balloons on the front. Inside, there was one sentence she would not let him read yet. "Save it," she said, sliding it into his jacket pocket herself. "It's for somebody who needs it more than you do. Nobody needs your homework more than your daddy needs a nap," he said, and she laughed. The kind of laugh that made the whole apartment feel less tired than it was. He kissed the top of her head, told her Miss Odessa next door had eyes on her until he was back, and headed for the truck. Neither of them knew that the last stop on his route that night was a hotel 40 floors up, where a woman was running out of reasons to keep glancing at an elevator. Back in the ballroom, the clock ticked past 7. The manager approached Victoria's table, cleared his throat twice before he found the words, and asked quietly if she would like the staff to begin serving or hold a little longer. "Hold a little longer," she said. He nodded and stepped back, and she went on watching the doors, the way she had watched them for the past hour, waiting for the version of her life where people still showed up when there was nothing left for them to gain. She thought of the board meetings where every seat had filled before she had even sat down. She thought of the gala 2 years prior, The one before the accident. The one where she could not get through a hallway without someone touching her arm to say hello. She wondered, not for the first time that night, whether any of it had ever been about her, or whether it had always been about what she could do for the people standing near her. The elevator chimed again. She straightened in her chair out of habit more than hope then. The doors slid open on an empty hallway. Victoria looked at the cake, untouched under its candles, and told herself the only lie she had left that night. Maybe they're just running late. Somewhere below her, 40 floors down, a truck pulled into the hotel's loading dock, its engine ticking as it cooled, carrying a man who had no idea he was about to walk into the middle of it. 7:15 came and went, and the excuses kept arriving in Victoria's phone like a slow drip she could not shut off. A text from a board member who said he was so sorry, something came up. A voicemail from an old friend who did not even bother to name what the emergency was. A one-word reply from someone she had once flown across the country to sit beside at his own father's funeral. Can't. No apology felt like it costly, the person sending it anything. Her assistant, Priya, hovered near the head table with her tablet, scrolling through the guest list like she was hoping the names would rearrange themselves into people who actually showed up. 2 more said they might still make it, she offered, and Victoria heard the might for exactly what it was. You can head out, Priya. It's late. I don't mind staying. Go home, Victoria said it gently, but it was not a request. She did not need another person watching her sit there. She had had enough of being watched that night, by empty chairs, if nothing else. Around the ballroom, the staff had started making small, quiet decisions on their own. A server near the kitchen doors leaned toward another and murmured something behind her hand. Neither of them moved toward Victoria's table, but a busser started collecting the untouched champagne flutes from the tables furthest from her, the ones close enough to the exit that it would not seem obvious. She noticed. She noticed everything that night, the way a person did when they were the only soul in a room built for 80. 2 years prior, the board had tried to ease her out after the accident. Quietly, of course. Nobody put it in an email. A transition committee. A reassessment of executive capacity. She had sat through 3 separate meetings where grown men who owed their salaries to her 12-hour days looked everywhere but at the wheelchair, as if her legs were the thing making them uncomfortable and not their own cowardice. She fought them, kept her seat, and watched the company's earnings climb the following year despite, or maybe because, she refused to let a single one of them forget what she had built. The business rebuilt itself around her just fine. The people never did. She used to think that was the price of visibility, that anyone successful enough eventually thinned out their circle down to the ones who really meant it. Now she wondered if the accident had not just revealed something that was always true. Maybe nobody was ever staying for her. Maybe they were staying for the version of her that could still stand at a podium and make them feel important by association. She looked at the chairs again, 40 of them, gold-rimmed, with an orchid centerpiece at every 4th table, each one representing a name she had personally written herself. Each one was then a small, precise piece of evidence. Down in the loading dock, Dennis backed his truck against the concrete curb and killed the engine. It was his last stop of the night, a hotel account his company serviced twice a week, mostly linens and kitchen supplies. He was tired in the specific way that settled into a person's shoulders after 14 hours behind a wheel, but he still whistled something under his breath as he hauled the dolly out the back. A hotel employee propped the service door for him, and Dennis noticed right away that something about that night felt off. 2 servers walked past carrying full trays back toward the kitchen instead of out to the floor. A third was stacking champagne flutes still full, tipping them out one by one into a bus bin like the wine had done something wrong. Slow night? Dennis asked, mostly to make conversation while he signed the delivery slip. The young woman glanced toward the ballroom doors, then back at him, like she was deciding whether it was her place to say anything. There's a party upstairs. Was supposed to be a big one. Birthday. She shrugged. Guest lists like 40 people. Maybe 5 showed. Now it's nobody. Nobody? The woman's still in there. She said it quieter, almost like she did not want the words carrying. Sitting by herself next to her own cake. Dennis did not say anything right away. He finished signing the slip, handed it back, and told himself this was not his business, that he had a daughter waiting on Miss Odessa's couch and a route sheet that said he had clocked out 20 minutes ago. But something about the way the young woman said by herself stayed with him the way certain things did, the way his wife's voice used to stay with him for hours after she had said something ordinary at breakfast. He wheeled the dolly toward the loading elevator instead of back to his truck, telling himself he just wanted to see for himself, that was all, just a look, and then he would go home. The service elevator opened near the edge of the ballroom, close enough that he could see through the gap in the doors without anyone noticing him standing there. Gold chairs, white orchids, a 3-tier cake with candles burned down to stubs nobody had bothered to relight. And in the middle of all of it, a woman in a green dress sat alone in a wheelchair, staring at a doorway that had not opened in 20 minutes. Dennis stood there longer than he meant to. He could have left right then. Nobody would ever know he had seen anything at all. He had his own load to carry, his own daughter to get home to, and his own tired body telling him the day was over. But he did not move. He just stood there, watching a stranger sit alone with a cake nobody was going to help her cut, and something in him that his own daughter would recognize immediately started making a decision he had not yet said out loud. Dennis made it as far as the parking garage. He had the dolly loaded back into the truck, the engine running and the heat clicking on against the cold that had settled in since sunset. His hands were on the wheel. He was not moving. He kept seeing her, the green dress, the candles burned down. The way she sat so straight in that chair, like sitting up, was the only thing left she had control over. He pulled out his phone and called Miss Odessa first, telling her he was running a little behind. Everything was fine, and to just tell Maya he would be there soon. Then he sat there another minute with the phone in his lap, the engine idling, doing nothing. His daughter was the one who broke it. Not that night. She was not even there, but her voice was, the way it always was when he was about to talk himself out of something. Never walk past somebody's pain if you got a chance to lessen it. He had said that to her so many times he had stopped noticing he was the one who needed reminding sometimes. He checked his wallet before he did anything else, because that was just who he was. A man who counted what he had before he decided what he could give. $11 and change, not much. Enough for a ribbon, maybe. Enough for something. He called Maya real quick, not to ask permission, just because he wanted to hear her before he did this. "You still up? I'm doing my worksheet." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a pencil tapping. "You coming home?" "Little while yet, I gotta ask you something first." He told her what he had seen. The empty chairs, the cake, the woman sitting by herself in a room built for 80 people. He did not dress it up. He just told her plainly, the way he told her everything. Maya did not say anything for a second. Then she asked, "Is she really spending her birthday all alone?" "Looks that way, baby." Another pause followed, shorter this time. "We can't leave her like that." That was it. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Dennis felt something settle in his chest, the kind of certainty that did not need explaining to anybody, least of all himself. "I gotta run in the hotel shop right quick," he told her. "I'll be home after." "Can I come?" He almost said no, wanting to tell her to stay put with Miss Odessa, but something about that night made him want her there. Maybe because she was the one who had put the thought in his head to begin with. Maybe because some things a person should not do alone. "Ask Miss Odessa to walk you down to the truck. I'll swing by and grab you first." 15 minutes later, Maya was in the passenger seat, her seatbelt crossed over her yellow cardigan, with the manila folder from her school bag on her lap. She had not asked why they were going to a hotel. She trusted him the way children did when they had never had a real reason not to. The hotel gift shop was closing up when they got there, a tired-looking clerk halfway through counting the register. Dennis bought a plain paper gift bag and a length of gold ribbon, the cheapest one on the rack, and it still took nearly everything in his wallet. He tied the ribbon himself in the parking garage, clumsy at first, then better, while Maya watched over his shoulder like it was the most important knot either of them would ever tie. "What are we putting in it?" she asked. Dennis did not have an answer, not really. He had not thought that far ahead. He was moving on instinct. the way a person did when they saw something wrong and their body decided before their head caught up. She pulled the folder out of her bag, the one with her homework, and slid out the card she had made in art class that afternoon. It featured balloons drawn in yellow crayon. She had made him promise to save it for somebody who needed it more than he did, and she looked up at him now, like she already knew this was the person she had meant. For her, she said, like it was obvious. Dennis did not argue. He watched her tuck the card into the bag, and something about the sight of it, his daughter giving away the one nice thing she had made all week to a stranger, sat in his chest, heavier than anything that had happened to him all year. They walked back through the lobby together, Dennis in his work jacket, Maya's hand in his, and the paper bag swinging between them. A hotel employee near the ballroom entrance stopped them, polite but firm, and asked if they were on the guest list. "We're not," Dennis said plainly. "I know that. I saw there wasn't anybody up here for her, and that didn't sit right with me. We won't stay long." The employee hesitated, glanced back toward the ballroom doors, then toward a manager standing near the coat check, who had clearly been listening. The manager studied Dennis for a second, his uniform jacket still smelling faintly of the delivery truck, his daughter's yellow cardigan, and the paper gift bag that had cost him his last few dollars. And something in his face softened. "Go on in," the manager said quietly. "Just go on." The ballroom doors were heavier than Dennis expected, and they swung open onto that same long hallway he had looked through an hour prior from the service elevator. Soft piano music drifted out from somewhere near the back, unhurried, like the pianist had nowhere else to be that night either. The room opened up in front of them, gold chairs catching the chandelier light, and white orchids untouched on every table. And there she was, alone, in the green dress, in the wheelchair, her back turned to the door. She heard their footsteps before she turned around. Perhaps she expected a waiter, perhaps she had stopped expecting anything at all. Instead, she turned and found a father holding his daughter's hand, a paper gift bag between them, standing in the doorway of a room built for 80 people who never came. Dennis did not have a speech ready. He had never planned one. He just took a breath, took a step forward, and opened his mouth to say the first thing that came to him. "I'm sorry to just walk in on you like this." That was the first thing Dennis said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, his voice not quite steady. He was not a man who was used to inserting himself where he was not wanted, and every instinct in his body was telling him he was doing exactly that right then. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, like she was trying to work out whether he was real. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No, ma'am, you don't." He shifted his weight, glanced down at Maya, then back up. "I was making a delivery downstairs. One of your staff mentioned you were up here celebrating your birthday, and I saw the room was—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. They were both looking at the same 40 empty chairs. "I wasn't invited," he said plainly, "because there was no version of that night where pretending otherwise helped. I know that. I couldn't go home knowing somebody was sitting up here alone on their birthday. Didn't sit right with me." Victoria's mouth opened like she wanted to say something gracious and polished, the kind of thing she had said to strangers 1,000 times at galas and shareholder dinners. Nothing came out. She was too tired, or too raw, or too far past the point where the practiced version of herself could reach her. Maya stepped forward before the silence could get uncomfortable. She had been holding the paper gift bag against her chest with both hands, and now she held it out, arms fully extended, the way children did when they were not sure if a gift would be accepted. "I made this for somebody who needed it," Maya said. "My dad says that's you tonight." Victoria took the bag slowly, like it might not be real either. Inside was the card, yellow crayon balloons on the front, slightly bent at one corner from the walk across the parking garage. She opened it carefully. There was one sentence, written in a child's careful handwriting, slightly uneven, where the letters got smaller toward the end of the line because she had run out of room. "No birthday should end with an empty chair." Victoria read it once, then she read it again, like she needed to be sure it said what she thought it said. And then she broke. Not loudly, not the way people broke in movies. It was quieter than that, more private. Her shoulders dropped first, Then her hand came up to cover her mouth, and then the tears she had been holding back for 2 hours finally arrived all at once, silent and unstoppable. She had spent 2 hours watching an elevator that never opened on the right person. She had spent 2 years wondering whether anyone had ever actually stayed for her, or only for what she could do for them. A 5-year-old in a yellow cardigan had just answered the question without knowing she was asking it. Dennis did not say anything. He had raised a daughter alone long enough to know that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was just let somebody cry without rushing to fix it. After a while, Victoria wiped her face with the back of her hand, laughed a little at herself, and looked up at both of them like she was seeing them clearly for the first time. "I'm sorry. This isn't how I usually meet people." "Don't apologize," Dennis said. "Not tonight." She looked at the cake, still sitting untouched beneath its half-burned candles, and then back at Dennis and Maya. "Would you two like to stay? There's obviously more food than anyone could possibly need." Maya looked up at her dad, and Dennis looked at the mountain of cake and the dozens of empty plates and said, "We'd like that." It was such a small thing, the three of them settling into chairs near the head table, but the room changed the moment they did. A server near the kitchen doors, who had been standing frozen for the better part of an hour, unsure what to do with himself, quietly picked up a lighter and walked over to relight the candles on the cake. Nobody had asked him to. He just did it, like he had been waiting for a reason. The pianist, who had never stopped playing but had drifted into something aimless and quiet, shifted without any signal into the opening bars of Happy Birthday, soft enough that it could almost pass for coincidence. Victoria looked over at the piano, startled, then back at Dennis, like she was not sure this was actually happening. "Would you sing with us?" Dennis asked. Not because he had a plan, just because it felt like the right thing to offer. And she did. She sang quietly at first, her voice thin and a little cracked, then steadier, until by the last line she was almost laughing through it, sharing the first real laugh that had touched her face all night. Maya sang loudly enough for all three of them. A server near the back joined in without meaning to. By the final note, 3 more staff members had wandered closer, drawn by the sound of a birthday song finally being sung in a room that had given up expecting one. Nobody in that ballroom was scheduled to care that night. Nobody was being paid to stay past their shift, or told to relight a candle, or expected to sing along with 2 strangers and a 5-year-old. And yet, one by one, that was exactly what was happening. Not because anyone asked, but because compassion, once it started moving through a room, had a way of finding people who did not know they were waiting for permission to show it. Outside the ballroom windows, 40 floors up, the city kept going the way it always did, indifferent to what was happening behind the glass. But a local photographer working a separate event downstairs happened to glance up at the right moment, catching a strange, small gathering through the window. An untouched cake suddenly lit again, a stranger in a green dress laughing through tears, and a little girl in a yellow cardigan standing at the center of it like she belonged there. He did not know the story. He just knew it was worth a photo. He had no idea yet what that photo was going to set in motion. If moments like that reminded the audience that the world still turned on ordinary people choosing to care, they were urged not to let this be a story they just scrolled past. Viewers were invited to subscribe and stay along, because every story told existed to remind people that compassion still had a place in the world, and it usually looked smaller than one would expect. By the time the cake was finally cut, the ballroom did not look like the same room it had been an hour prior. The pastry chef came out from the kitchen himself, still in his apron, and insisted on cutting the first slice personally, muttering something about how a cake that good should not have gone the whole night untouched. The housekeeping staff, who had been quietly stripping the far tables of unused silverware, stopped what they were doing and drifted closer instead, drawn in the way people were drawn toward warmth on a cold night. Even the security guard stationed near the elevator bank wandered over during a lull, arms crossed, a small smile on his face he did not seem to notice was there. Nobody organized any of it. Nobody was told to stay past their shift or asked to participate. They just did, one person at a time, the way a single match does not do much on its own, but changes everything once it touches the next one. Victoria watched all of it happening around her with an expression Dennis recognized, because he had worn it himself. the look of someone who expected to end the night alone and was still catching up to the fact that she was not. "Can I ask you something?" she said, once the noise around them settled into something quieter, the pianist easing into something slow and unhurried, while Maya was off at a nearby table drawing on the back of a paper placemat with a server's borrowed pen. "Go ahead. Why did you actually come back up here? You could have just gone home. Nobody would have known." Dennis considered that for a second, turning his water glass slowly on the tablecloth. "I would have known," he said. "That's usually enough reason for me not to do a thing, or to do it, whichever way it goes." Victoria studied him for a moment, like she was trying to figure out if there was a version of that sentence with more calculation behind it, some angle she had not found yet. There was not one, and eventually she seemed to understand that. "I spent 2 years," she said slowly, "waiting for the moment where losing the use of my legs would be the hardest part of what happened to me. It never was." She looked around at the tables, the ones that had stayed empty all night, gold chairs pulled out and never sat in. The hardest part was learning how many people were only ever standing close to me because of what standing close to me got them. Dennis did not rush to fill the silence after that. He just nodded, because he understood something about being reduced to what a person could offer somebody, rather than who they actually were. Not the exact same circumstance as hers, but close enough in shape that he recognized it. "I lost my wife 4 years ago," he said, when the moment felt right for it. People show up a lot the first couple weeks after something like that. Casseroles, cards, everybody wants to help you carry it right when it's freshest, right when it makes them feel good to help. Then life keeps moving for them, and it stopped moving for me and my daughter, and most of those same people just didn't come back around. How do you keep going after that? You don't have a choice, mostly. You got a kid looking at you every morning, and she needs you to keep going whether you feel like it or not, so you do. And somewhere along the way you stop measuring your life by who shows up when it's easy, and you start paying attention to who's still there when there's nothing in it for them." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "I run a company that makes decisions worth millions of dollars every quarter," she finally said. "And I don't think anyone's ever put it to me that plainly before. Didn't mean it as advice, just how I got through it. It's the best advice I've gotten all year," she said, and she was not joking. They talked longer than either of them expected to, about missed school plays and midnight appliance repairs, about board meetings and investor calls, and about a 5-year-old who insisted on giving away the nicest thing she owned to someone who needed it more. Somewhere in the middle of it, Victoria realized she had not thought about the 40 empty chairs in almost 20 minutes. By the time the evening wound down, the ballroom looked less like an abandoned event and more like something that had happened on purpose. Plates scraped clean, coffee cups scattered across 3 tables instead of 1, and Maya asleep with her head on her folded arms near the window, the city lights glittering behind her like something out of a painting. Victoria watched the room, filled now not with the people she had expected, but with the people who had actually stayed, and something settled into place in her that felt less like resolution and more like clarity. She thought about the board meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. She thought about the quarterly numbers her executives were expecting to walk in and discuss. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, none of that felt like the most important thing waiting for her the next day. Dennis eventually scooped Maya up, careful not to wake her fully, her cheek pressed against his shoulder the way it had been since she was small enough to fit in one arm. At the door, Victoria thanked him again, and he told her, plainly, that she did not owe him anything for it. "You gave me my daughter's favorite drawing," Victoria said. "I think I owe you a little more than a thank you." He just smiled, shifted Maya's weight, and headed for the elevator. The next morning, Victoria arrived at her company's headquarters earlier than usual, holding a single folder instead of her usual stack of briefing documents. Her executive team was already gathered, expecting the standard rundown: quarterly earnings, expansion timelines, and investor updates. They had no idea that a folder with 4 handwritten words on the cover was about to change the direction of everything they had built. She sets it down on the table, took a breath, and looked around the room. "Last night changed my understanding of success," she said. "And I think it's time this company understood it too." The boardroom filled up the way it always did before a quarterly meeting, fresh coffee, tablets open, and executives trading small talk about earnings projections and the numbers they expected Victoria to walk them through. Nobody in the room had any reason to expect anything different that morning. Victoria set the folder down on the table without opening it right away. There were 4 words on the cover, handwritten, and nothing else. "Before we get into the quarter," she said, "I want to tell you about last night." A few executives exchanged glances, the kind that said they were humoring her, assuming this was a warm-up story before the real agenda started. She did not mind. She knew how this was going to sound before it landed. She told them plainly. No guests had come to her birthday. 40 invitations, dozens of acceptances, and by 7 o'clock she was sitting alone in a ballroom built for a party that never happened. She told them about the man who was not invited, and his daughter, and a handmade card with 1 sentence written in yellow crayon. She watched the room's expression shift from polite patience to something more uncertain as they realized she was not building toward a joke. "I've spent 15 years measuring what this company is worth by revenue," she said. "Growth, market share, how we're perceived by people who've never met a single person we actually serve. Last night, none of that was in the room with me. A delivery driver and his 5-year-old were." Silence settled over the table. "I don't want to keep running a company that only knows how to grow numbers," she said. "I want to run one that knows how to show up for people. Starting now." She opened the folder and slid copies of the proposal down the table. The room read in silence for a moment before the questions started, exactly the kind she had expected. "This isn't really our business," one of the board members offered carefully. "We're a technology company, not a nonprofit." "Shareholders are going to want to know how this serves growth," said another. "Charitable work is usually handled through a separate foundation arm, not folded into core operations," a third added, not unkindly, just cautiously. Victoria listened to each objection without interrupting, the way she used to do before the accident, back when she still believed patience was a form of respect rather than a performance. When they had finished, she leaned forward. "If this company can change entire industries," she said, "but can't figure out how to change a single family's situation when it's sitting right in front of us, then we've built something a lot smaller than I thought we had." Nobody argued with that directly. A few nodded slowly. One executive who had worked with her since the earliest years, back when the office had 2 desks and a space heater that only worked if it was kicked, finally said, "Tell us what you're proposing." She laid it out. A nationwide outreach initiative built around the people her company had never once mentioned in an earnings call. Single parents stretched too thin to catch a break. People adjusting to permanent disability with no roadmap for it. Caregivers running on empty, and kids who lost a parent and lost their footing along with them. Emergency grants, accessibility support, scholarships, mentorship pathways into real, sustainable work. "I'm calling it the Empty Chair Project," she said, "because last night I learned exactly what it feels like to have every seat at your table filled with names and none of them show up. I don't want anyone else in this city to learn that lesson the way I did." The room took a moment to sit with it. Then, slowly, the objections started turning into questions about implementation instead of justification, which was how Victoria knew it was actually going to happen. That afternoon, her office reached out to Dennis directly. He nearly did not pick up, assuming it was a scam call about his delivery route, but something made him answer anyway. "Mr. Dixon, this is Victoria Hale's office," the voice said. "She was wondering if you'd be willing to meet with her. Nothing formal. She just has some questions she'd like your input on." Dennis sat with the phone against his ear for a second, genuinely confused. "Input on what?" "She didn't say exactly. Just that she trusts your perspective." He agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and 2 days later found himself across a small table from her at a coffee shop near her office, with no photographers or assistants hovering, just 2 cups of coffee going lukewarm between them. Victoria did not ask him about business. She asked him what it was actually like, choosing between new shoes and groceries some months, working holidays because the extra pay made the difference, and missing a school play because a delivery route ran long, and there was no one else to cover it. She wrote down almost everything he said, not like a CEO taking notes for a press release, but like someone finally trying to understand something she had spent her whole career 2 steps removed from. "You're the only person who's asked me any of this," Dennis said at one point, half joking. "Usually people just assume they already know." "I used to be one of those people," Victoria admitted. "I'm trying not to be anymore." When he left, she watched him walk out through the window of the coffee shop, and for the first time since the accident had taken her legs, and, not long after, most of the people she thought she could count on, she did not feel like something was taken from her. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, like she finally knew what she was building toward. If viewers had made it that far and were still telling themselves they would subscribe later, they were asked to question honestly whether later had ever actually come for them before. The people in that story did not wait for the perfect moment to show up for each other. Audiences were encouraged not to wait for one either, but to subscribe then, because stories like that only kept getting told if people decided they were worth staying for. The Empty Chair Project launched without a press conference. There were no banners, no ribbon cutting, and no glossy campaign photos of Victoria shaking hands for a camera crew. She had insisted on that from the beginning, over the objections of a marketing team that wanted to turn her story into a headline. "People don't need to watch me get credit for this," she told them. "They need the help to actually reach them." So, it started quietly. A caseworker, in a modest office, 2 floors below Victoria's, managed a small budget line that grew every month as the board kept approving what they had once questioned. They processed real applications from real people, reviewed one at a time. A widowed father in another part of the city, drowning in childcare costs since his wife passed, received emergency coverage that let him keep his job instead of choosing between the two. A woman navigating life after a spinal injury got a modest grant that paid for a ramp she had been going without for a year, after climbing 3 concrete steps every day the hard way, because she had no other option. A grandmother raising 2 grandchildren on a fixed income got breathing room she had not had in longer than she could remember. A community college student, 1 semester from dropping out to cover his mother's medical bills, got a scholarship that let him finish instead. None of it made the news. All of it changed something for somebody. Victoria started asking Dennis to sit in on the application reviews, not as a formality, but because she had noticed something in the first few weeks. The committee, smart, well-meaning people with the right degrees and the right intentions, kept overlooking exactly the kind of situations Dennis lived every day. They missed families who did not apply because they were too proud, or too exhausted, or did not know the help existed in the first place. They overlooked people who fell through gaps that looked invisible on paper, but were obvious the moment a person had stood in one themselves. "This family," Dennis said one afternoon, tapping a folder on the conference table, "they're going to get denied because they didn't fill out the income section right. But look at this address. I deliver on that block twice a week. That building doesn't have working heat half the winter. They didn't skip the form because they didn't need help. They skipped it because somebody probably told them applying wasn't worth their time." The room went quiet, and then someone quietly amended the intake process the same week, adding a phone follow-up option for anyone whose paperwork came back incomplete, so nobody would get filtered out just for not knowing how to fill out a form correctly. It happened again the next month, and the month after that. Dennis kept noticing things nobody else on the committee would think to look for, not because he was smarter than them, but because he had lived on the other side of every form they were reviewing. Victoria started deferring to him more and more, and it did not go unnoticed. "People are going to talk," one of her senior executives told her privately, not unkindly. "A delivery driver sitting in on grant committee meetings. Some folks are going to wonder what he's getting out of it." "He's getting exactly what he's asked for," Victoria said. "Nothing. He hasn't taken a dollar, hasn't asked for a title, hasn't tried to leverage a single meeting into something for himself. If that makes people uncomfortable, it says more about them than it does about him." The executive did not have a response to that. Word did start to spread, the way it always did in smaller circles before it reached anyone bigger. Other applicants, community organizers, and a couple of local outreach groups who partnered with the project once they heard how it actually operated. Dennis became something like an informal advisor without ever asking for the position, showing up on his days off, reading through applications at his kitchen table some nights after Maya had gone to bed, and marking notes in the margins about details he thought the committee might be missing. He never stopped delivering packages. He never stopped coming home late some nights and early other nights, and he never stopped the version of his life that existed before any of this started. If anything, people who knew him said he seemed the same as he always was, steady, plain-spoken, and unimpressed with attention. The only difference then was that a woman who ran a company worth $900 million asked his opinion before she asked almost anyone else's. One afternoon, Maya tagged along to Victoria's office after school, sitting quietly in the corner with a coloring book while the adults finished a meeting. When it wrapped up, she wandered over to Victoria's desk and stopped. There, in a small frame near the edge of the desk, sat the card she had made, the same yellow crayon balloons, and the same sentence in her careful, uneven handwriting. "You kept it," Maya said, surprised. "Every morning," Victoria told her, "before I look at anything else on this desk, I look at that first." Maya studied it for a second, like she was trying to understand why a piece of homework she almost had not finished in time for art class meant something to a grown woman with an office this big. "Why?" she finally asked. Victoria thought about it for a moment before she answered, choosing her words the way she chose them in board meetings now, carefully, like they mattered. "Because it reminds me who I want to be, every single day, before anybody else in this building has a chance to remind me who they think I should be instead." Maya did not fully understand that yet, not the way an adult would, but she nodded anyway, the way kids did when they sensed something important, even if the words had not caught up to them. Outside, Dennis waited by the elevator, watching the two of them through the open office door, and for a moment he let himself notice, really notice, how far a single decision on a single night had managed to travel, quietly, without anyone ever meaning for it to travel anywhere at all. Word traveled slowly through certain circles and instantly through others. By the 4th month of the empty chair project, enough of it had reached the right ears that some of the same names from Victoria's birthday guest list started appearing in her inbox again. A board member from a rival firm sent a note congratulating her on the wonderful new initiative, as though he had not spent the night of her birthday citing a traffic delay that never once showed up as a headline on the local news. A former mentor, someone she used to call for advice before every major decision, called to say he was so proud of the direction she had taken the company, and did not mention the party at all, like it simply never happened. A woman she had once considered one of her closest friends, someone she had known since business school, someone who had stood beside her at industry dinners for over a decade, sent flowers to the office with a card that read, "So sorry I couldn't make it. Let's catch up soon." Victoria read it twice, waiting to feel something close to forgiveness. What she felt instead was clarity. She received all of it with the same measured courtesy she had always shown people, because that was who she was, and she was not interested in becoming someone else just to punish anyone. But something underneath the courtesy had changed permanently. She no longer confused attention with loyalty, the way she used to do. She had learned the difference the hard way, and it was not a lesson she planned on forgetting, just because people had started circling back, now that there was something to be associated with. Dennis noticed it too, the way people orbited closer once a thing became successful enough to reflect well on them. He did not say much about it directly, but one afternoon, going through applications together, he offered her the only piece of advice about it he ever gave. "People can change," he said, not looking up from the folder in front of him. "I believe that, but changing and showing up when it's convenient again ain't the same thing. Only you get to decide who actually earns a seat back at your table." Victoria did not respond right away, but the sentence stayed with her the way certain things did, turning over quietly in the back of her mind for days afterward. Instead of trying to rebuild the old relationships that dissolved the moment she stopped being useful to maintain, she decided to do something different. She planned a dinner, not a gala, not a fundraiser, and nothing built for press coverage or investor optics. It was a community appreciation dinner, small and unannounced, held in a modest event space instead of a rooftop ballroom. The guest list looked nothing like the one from her birthday. There were no board members, no investors, and no old acquaintances hoping to be photographed near her success. Instead, she invited the caseworkers who processed every application personally. She brought in the families whose situations had changed because of a grant, or a scholarship, or an accessibility ramp they had been going without. And, quietly, she invited the hotel staff from that night, the pastry chef who relit the candles without being asked, the pianist who eased into Happy Birthday like he had been waiting for a reason all along, and the housekeeper and the security guard who had wandered over, one by one, until a room built for loneliness turned into something else entirely. They were stunned when the invitations arrived. Several of them assumed it was a mistake at first, a form letter sent to the wrong address. It was not. At the dinner, Victoria made a point of greeting each of them personally, by name, remembering small details from that night that most people would not have bothered to hold on to. Which server had 2 kids at home, which one had been covering an extra shift that week, and the exact moment the pianist had shifted songs without anyone telling him to. "I can't believe you remember all that," the pastry chef said, shaking his head. "How could I forget?" Victoria said. "The people who refused to forget me." The room settled into something warm and unforced, with laughter carrying between tables that had nothing gold-rimmed or orchid-covered about them, just simple centerpieces and real conversation. Dennis and Maya sat near the middle of it all, not as guests of honor, and not singled out or introduced with any fanfare, but simply present, the way family was present. Near the end of the evening, someone noticed a single chair set apart near the small stage, deliberately empty, with no place setting and no name card. A guest leaned toward Victoria and asked, gently, if someone could not make it after all. Victoria smiled, and it was not a sad smile. "It's a reminder," she said. "A reminder of what? That nobody in this room, or any room I'm ever a part of again, should have to sit alone." The guest nodded slowly, understanding settling over the table, and the conversation moved on, but the chair stayed where it was for the rest of the night, visible from nearly every seat in the room, a small, quiet fixture nobody needed explained twice. If this story reminded the audience that the strongest people a person would ever meet were not always the richest ones in the room, but the kindest, they were encouraged not to close the video out without subscribing first. Every subscription was what kept stories like this one alive and in front of people who needed reminding that compassion still meant something in the world. A year moved faster than anyone expected it to, when it was filled with actual purpose instead of just calendar pages turning. Victoria barely noticed the months passing until her assistant reminded her, almost in passing, that her birthday was coming up again. "Same ballroom?" Priya asked, half out of habit, already reaching for the vendor contact list from the year before. Victoria paused at that. She had not thought about the room since the night it had emptied out around her, and then, against every reasonable expectation, filled back up with exactly the right people instead of the ones she had invited. "Yes," she said finally, "same ballroom, same everything." Priya looked up, uncertain whether that was a strange choice or an obvious one, but did not ask. She just started making calls. The morning of the party, the crew arrived to set up the same way they did a year prior. The same chandeliers polished to the same shine, the same wall of glass turning the skyline into a second source of light, and the same round tables draped in white. For a moment, standing in the doorway before anyone else arrived, Victoria almost felt the ghost of that other night settle over her, the memory of sitting alone beside an untouched cake, watching an elevator that refused to open on anyone she recognized. But the guest list that year had nothing in common with the one from 12 months before. By 6 o'clock, the room was filling in a way it never did the first time. Families started arriving. Some she recognized immediately, some she had only ever seen as a name on a grant application. A widowed father walked in with his 2 sons, both of them in slightly too big button-down shirts, clearly bought for the occasion, and both of them wide-eyed at the chandeliers. A woman who received an accessibility grant rolled in on her own set of wheels, laughing with someone beside her, completely unbothered by a room she might once have assumed was not built with her in mind. The grandmother raising her 2 grandchildren arrived with both kids trailing behind her, already reaching for the dessert table before their coats were even off. The hotel staff were there too, not working this time, but seated as guests. The pastry chef in a suit instead of his apron, and the pianist arriving early enough to sit at his own instrument and simply play for the joy of it, rather than out of professional obligation. The housekeeper, who had wandered over uninvited a year before, now sat at a table near the front, laughing with the security guard beside her, like old friends catching up rather than co-workers who happened to share one strange, beautiful night. By 7 o'clock, the same hour that, 1 year prior, marked the moment Victoria finally stopped believing anyone was coming, the ballroom was loud with conversation, full of children weaving between table legs, and full of the specific, chaotic warmth of a room where everyone actually wanted to be there. Dennis arrived a little after 7, not in his delivery uniform this time, but in a jacket Maya had picked out for him herself, insisting it was the one that made him look like Victoria's friend, and not like he was about to unload boxes. Maya walked in ahead of him in a dress the same soft yellow as the cardigan she wore the night they first met, her hair done in 2 neat buns, practically running the last few steps toward Victoria the moment she spotted her. Victoria opened her arms, and Maya folded into them without hesitation, with no words needed between them, sharing the kind of greeting that only happened between people who had stopped being strangers to each other a long time ago. "Happy birthday," Maya said into her shoulder. "Thank you for coming back," Victoria said, and meant it in a way that went far beyond the party. When the moment came for her to say a few words, something Priya had gently reminded her was expected, given the crowd and the occasion, Victoria did not reach for prepared remarks. She simply stood near the small stage, microphone in hand, and looks out over a room she had once sat in completely alone. "A year ago," she said, "I stood in this exact room and believed I'd finally learned the truth about the people in my life. Every seat was empty. Every name on my guest list had somewhere better to be, and I sat right over there." She gestured toward the spot near the window, still recognizable even a year later, convinced I understood, once and for all, exactly how alone a person could be, even while surrounded by everything money can buy. The room quieted, though it was the comfortable kind of quiet, full of people who already knew this story, because most of them had lived some version of it themselves. "I was wrong," she continued. "Not about the loneliness, that part was real. I was wrong about what this room was capable of becoming, because it turns out an empty ballroom isn't the end of a story. Sometimes it's just the place where the real one finally starts." She looked toward Dennis and Maya, standing near the front, and did not need to say their names for everyone in the room to understand exactly who she was talking about. A year ago, a man who had no reason to walk through those doors walked through them anyway. His daughter handed me a card that said something I don't think I'd ever really understood before that night, that no birthday should end with an empty chair. "I want every person in this room to know that you are the reason that sentence became something bigger than one night in one ballroom. You are the Empty Chair Project. Every one of you." She gestured toward the small, deliberately empty chair set near the stage, the same one from the appreciation dinner months earlier, carried over and placed there that night on purpose. "This chair stays empty at every event we hold from now on," she said. "Not because it's sad, because it's a promise that there is always room, at every table we ever set, for one more person who needs it. That nobody, in any room I have anything to do with, should ever have to sit alone again." The applause that followed was not polite, the kind executives gave because it was expected. It rose slowly, and then all at once, with people getting to their feet across the room, not for Victoria specifically, but for something bigger that everyone in the room recognized in themselves. The version of the last year where they were the one who needed help, or the one who gave it, or both. Afterward, once the speeches were done and the cake had been cut and the room had settled back into easy conversation, Victoria found Dennis near the edge of the dance floor, watching Maya spin in circles with 2 other kids from the neighborhood Grant families, all 3 of them laughing too hard to keep any kind of rhythm. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, "for what you did that night. I don't think I've said it plainly enough in all this time." Dennis shrugged, watching his daughter instead of looking at her. "You would have done the same, if the situation was flipped." "I'm honestly not sure I would have," Victoria admitted. "I'd like to think so. I'm not sure I was that person yet, a year ago. You are now, Dennis said simply, and there was no argument in him, no performance. Just a fact he was stating the way he stated most things, plainly, and because he believed it. Victoria looked back out at the room, full, loud, and alive in a way it never managed to be the first time around, and let herself believe him. 6 months after the second birthday celebration, the delivery route sheets at the regional depot no longer carried the name Dennis Dixon. The transition had not been born out of an executive handout or a pity title manufactured in a corporate boardroom. It had happened because the empty chair project had outgrown its volunteer roots, requiring someone who understood that an application was not just a stack of stapled papers, but a window into a living room where someone was running out of choices. Victoria had offered him the position of Director of Community Operations, a role with flexible hours that allowed him to finally see the sun rise from his kitchen table rather than a truck cabin. Yet, as Dennis sat in his new office on the second floor of the Hale building, he still wore his sturdy work boots. His desk did not look like an executive's. It was piled with neighborhood map printouts, scribbled sticky notes, and a worn ceramic mug Maya had painted for him at a local community center. "You're late for your own evaluation," a voice called out from the doorway. Dennis looked up to see Victoria wheeling herself into the room. She was not wearing the sharp, armor-like corporate suits she used to favor before the accident. Today, she wore a comfortable knit sweater, her laptop resting on her lap, and a relaxed brightness in her eyes that no quarterly profit margin could ever buy. "I'm not late," Dennis said, a familiar easy grin touching his face as he tapped his wristwatch. "I'm practicing what you call strategic delay. Besides, I was looking over the East District outreach numbers. We managed to get those 3 families into the winter utility program before the first freeze." "I saw," Victoria said, rolling up alongside his desk. She closed her laptop, leaning back with a sigh that carried deep satisfaction. The board approved the expansion budget this morning without a single objection. "Do you remember 3 years ago? They would have fought me for 3 months over a fraction of that amount." "They learned to stop arguing with you," Dennis noted, chuckling. "It saves them time." "They learned to stop arguing with us," Victoria corrected gently, emphasizing the last word. She looked around his office, her gaze lingering on a framed picture on his wall, a snapshot from the appreciation dinner showing Dennis, Maya, and herself laughing together near the stage. "How is Maya handling the new school?" "She likes it. Miss Odessa says she's already running the playground," Dennis said, his expression softening instantly the way it always did when his daughter was mentioned. "She asked if you were coming over for Sunday dinner. Said she wants to show you the science project you helped her research." "Tell her I wouldn't miss it for anything. And tell her if we use the biochemical models we talked about, she's guaranteed an A." They shared a quiet laugh, and the comfortable silence that followed served as a testament to how seamlessly their lives had stitched together. They were no longer 2 people from different worlds who happened to cross paths in a lonely ballroom. They had become anchors for one another. Victoria had provided Dennis with the stability to finally breathe after years of survival, and Dennis had given Victoria an entry point back into a world that valued her for her humanity rather than her posture. Later that evening, after the office building had emptied out and the cleaning crews had begun their rounds, Victoria found herself heading down to the ground floor. Before leaving for the night, she decided to make a detour. She wheeled herself through the glass double doors of the Grand Hotel adjacent to her headquarters. The ballroom was dark, the staff having closed it up after an afternoon corporate luncheon. The crystal chandeliers were dimmed to a soft, amber night glow, casting long geometric shadows across the vast, polished marble floor. Victoria rolled toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It was the exact spot where she had sat 2 years prior, a woman in an emerald satin dress, drowning in a silence so heavy it felt physical. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass, remembering the stinging shame of the unreturned texts, the hollow excuses, and the terrifying realization that her success had surrounded her with ghosts instead of friends. But as she looked at the reflection of the empty room behind her, she did not feel the old ache. The memory no longer had the power to make her flinch. It had been stripped of its cruelty, transformed instead into the foundation of everything she was proud of today. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open, breaking the stillness. Victoria turned her chair around. Walking through the shadows of the dim ballroom were Dennis and Maya. Maya, now a taller, confident young girl, was still wearing a bright yellow sweater, her hand tucked firmly into her father's larger grip. "Priya said we could find you down here," Dennis said, his voice echoing softly against the high ceilings. "We brought takeout, figured nobody should have to look at a nice view on an empty stomach. I was just thinking about the first night you walked in here," Victoria said as they approached. Maya walked up to the side of Victoria's wheelchair, leaning against the armrest familiarly. "You were crying," Maya recalled softly, her childhood memory clear and unburdened. "And the cake looked really lonely." "It was very lonely," Victoria agreed, reaching out to gently squeeze Maya's shoulder. "But then a very brave little girl handed me a card she was supposed to keep for herself." "My dad says kindness always finds its way home," Maya said, looking up at Dennis with an expression of pure pride. "I think this ballroom is where it lives now." Dennis walked over to the edge of the stage area nearby. There, sitting quietly under a single spotlight that the hotel kept illuminated out of respect for Victoria's wishes, was the single, unadorned wooden chair. It bore no name, no decorations, and no velvet ropes to keep people away. It simply remained empty, a permanent fixture in a room that would never be truly empty again. Dennis looked at the chair, then back at Victoria. "It's a good anchor," he said quietly. "It reminds me of who we are when the lights are off," Victoria replied, her voice steady and filled with immense gratitude. She looked at the father and daughter standing beside her in the quiet room. "Success can fill a room with people who want to be seen near you, Dennis, but it takes something entirely different to find the ones who are willing to stay when there's nothing left to gain." "We didn't come for what you had, Victoria," Dennis said, stepping closer and resting a hand on the back of her chair. "We just came because a seat was empty, and we're not going anywhere." Victoria looked out at the glittering city below them, the millions of windows glowing like tiny stars in the night. Somewhere out there, she knew, there were other people sitting in dark rooms, looking at empty chairs, wondering if anyone would ever truly see them. But she also knew that as long as the Empty Chair Project existed, and as long as people like Dennis Dixon were willing to listen to the quiet margins of the world, those chairs wouldn't stay empty for long. The three of them stood together by the window, their shadows stretching across the marble floor toward the lone wooden chair on the stage. The camera slowly began to pull back, moving away from the glass, gliding past the elegant tables and the dim crystal chandeliers, until the figures of the corporate executive, the single father, and the little girl grew smaller in the frame. The lens lingered for one final, unbroken moment on the empty chair. It no longer stood as a monument to abandonment or a symbol of grief. It stood as an open invitation, a quiet, unshakable promise that somewhere in the dark, someone would always choose to step out of the crowd, cross the room, and take a seat beside the person the rest of the world had overlooked. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.